you to our second session here at the conference on the Pacific War at 70. Today we'll be delving into vast areas of World War II in the Pacific. Before we begin, I'd like to offer just a word of thanks for the fantastic support we've gotten from the College of Arts and Sciences, from the Office of University Advancement, from the School of Music, and from the faculty and staff of the Department of History. All of our sessions today will be held in this auditorium with morning and afternoon breaks. There will be time for lunch, which will be on your own. The Ohio Union, which is located that direction just across 12th Avenue, features a variety of easy lunch options, as well as a diner and a tavern and a marketplace. And there are numerous restaurants up and down High Street to our east, within a short walking distance of the building. Today we're going to begin with a look at the diplomacy of the Pacific War, followed by a discussion of the destruction of the Japanese Empire, and then an analysis of the end of the war in East and Southeast Asia. I am pleased, personally, to begin by establishing the international context of the Pacific War by analyzing the diplomatic and political conflicts and controversies involving the United States and Japan in the 1930s and early 1940s. My history department colleague Peter Mansour, who is a professor of history, and the General Raymond E. Mason Jr., chair in military history, will take the podium at 10:45 to discuss the military operations that destroyed the Japanese Empire in 1945, including the invasions of Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, as well as the air and sea campaigns that devastated Japanese cities and choked off Japan's seaborne commerce. Following lunch, we'll welcome Professor Ronald Spector, Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University. His presentation will explain why, in many places after the Japanese surrender in September 1945, fighting in Asia and the Pacific never really stopped. We'll conclude our conference at 3:30 this afternoon with a special session featuring a panel among 3 veterans of the Pacific War, 2 Marines and a Navy officer, in a discussion moderated by former Columbus Mayor Brad Lashutka. That session will close with a very special spoken and musical memorial tribute to all of the Ohio State University students and alumni who served in the Pacific War. And now session number 2. I am, by the way, Peter Hahn, a professor of history here at Ohio State and currently serving as Dean of Arts and Humanities. And I'm going to analyze the American diplomatic approach to the Pacific War as it emerged in the early 20th century, middle 20th century, and assess the origins of the American-Japanese conflict, as well as the wartime diplomacy of the United States government from roughly 1931 to 1945. I will be developing for you, give me just a minute for a technical reset. I will be developing for you 5 themes. As follows. First, we'll look at the long legacy of imperial conflict in East Asia prior to 1931. Secondly, we'll look at Franklin Roosevelt's approach to Japan in the first 6 years or 8 years of his administration. I'll be establishing the context in which Franklin Roosevelt operated and made decisions, and begin to tease out his approach as the so-called Japanese threat mounted in the later part of the decade. I'll focus in then on the crucial period of 1939 to 1941, when U.S.-Japanese hostilities that eventually erupted at Pearl Harbor originated, slowly, gradually, but surely. Then I'll look briefly at the diplomacy of the Pacific War itself, 1941 to July 1945, and then at the crucial decisions pertaining to the diplomacy of victory in the late spring and summer of 1945. First, with regard to the long legacy, you might say in the most general sense that World War II in the Pacific originated in the decline of the Chinese Empire. We could go back further than that, but that's far enough to go. The Chinese Empire had been great and had dominated East Asia for centuries, but during the 19th century, it began to crumble and decline. And as it fell apart, as it lost its influence and its position of power, conflict among neighboring states and foreign imperial states ensued. First to come in like hungry vultures, one could say, were the European powers, who were engaged, by the way, in a worldwide imperialist surge, the second great imperialist wave, it's sometimes called, beginning in the mid-19th century and culminating in the decades preceding World War I. This map depicts, if you follow the color-coded key, this map depicts how the Russians, the British, the Germans, and the French, all predominantly European powers, moved in to China and outlined areas and began to carve out what they called spheres of influence, which were essentially prototype colonies. Japan, recently modernized in the late 19th century and eager to find its place in the sun, also joined the imperialist surge into territory formerly dominated by China. Japan achieved a remarkable growth in power and stature in the 1890s and early 1900s, first by fighting and winning the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, and then by starting and winning the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. In that second conflict, the Japanese gained control of Sakhalin Island and Port Arthur, and further flexed their muscle and made the other powers realize that they were a player to be taken seriously. In 1910, Japan annexed the peninsula of Korea, formally adding it onto Japan's growing imperial domain. The United States was also a player in this imperial carving of China. The U.S. had modernized and become wealthy during the middle 19th century. After the Civil War clearly reunified and strengthened the Republic, there was rapid industrialization, there was growing economic might, there was also unevenness in the economic growth, which led to a quest for foreign markets and foreign influence as a way of stabilizing the American economy. Beginning in the 1850s, but especially in the decades following the Civil War, the U.S., having established a continental territory in North America, having affirmed the bonds of union, and achieving greater economic power, the U.S. leaped out across the Pacific, as this map reveals. Some islands acquired in the 1850s, Alaska purchased in 1867, through decades following a further reach of American influence and territorial control. This peaked really in the 1890s, the late 1890s, 1898 in particular, when the U.S. acquired control of Hawaii, as well as Guam and the Philippine Islands. Guam and the Philippines, clear out across the Pacific, were prizes taken at the end of the Spanish-American War of 1898, a war that actually began over Cuba, but was fought in the Pacific. In the process of fighting that war, the U.S. Navy defeated the Spanish Navy, and the U.S. Army occupied the Philippines, and then the U.S. government made the decision to keep the Philippines under colonial administration. That decision was based in part on the premise that the Filipinos were not ready for independence, and if we, the United States, left, then some other great power is going to move in, and we don't want the Japanese or the British or the Germans or anyone else grabbing that territory, so we're just going to keep it for ourselves. So the U.S. also is becoming an imperial presence and assuming control of territories which gave them skin in the game of the imperial struggle that would emerge in East Asia. Now, one can see in the arrival of American and Japanese power, the simultaneous arrival of imperial ambition, imperial and ambitious schemes by these two upstart new powers, one can see in their simultaneous arrival the seeds of World War II. Because as both powers arrived and entered into imperial schemes, they came into some conflict as they competed for markets, as they vied for territory, as they warily eyed each other's burgeoning military power. For the first couple of decades of the 20th century, they kept the conflict under control. Theodore Roosevelt carefully used diplomacy to forestall the possibility that the conflict and rivalry might turn into military struggle. He negotiated a series of diplomatic agreements with the Japanese to compromise and settle various issues so they didn't run out of control. His successor, William Howard Taft, did the same thing. World War I brought a few conflicts between the two powers. Most notably, Japan took advantage of the war in Europe and Germany's preoccupation with fighting on that continent to occupy German colonies in the Pacific. The Caroline Islands and other archipelagos depicted here on this map by the dotted line transferred from German control to Japanese control during World War II. And at the end of the war, they were officially added to the Japanese Empire as mandates under the League of Nations. Japan also announced a policy called the 21 Demands. The 21 Demands during World War I, which was essentially a declaration that it expected a dominant position in China. That policy declaration was seen by the United States as a violation of American policy, the so-called open door policy of 1899, which projected for China an approach of respecting China's territorial sovereignty and allowing free trade. So there's a conflict between the open door policy of the US and the 21 Demands of Japan, but they resolved that in an agreement that Woodrow Wilson negotiated in 1917. So the First World War created a little rise of tensions, but they were kept under control. The 1920s was a decade when stability was restored to the US-Japanese relationship. For instance, at the Washington Naval Conference of 1921-22, the US and Japan and 7 other powers signed 3 major treaties designed to stabilize the situation in East Asia and elsewhere in the post-war world. Those 3 treaties provided that the 9 powers would limit their construction of naval fleets to avoid a naval armaments race, like the armaments race that had preceded and was believed to have aggravated World War I. Another agreement affirmed the open door policy in China. Thus, the US kind of got its way, got the other powers to acknowledge that China's sovereignty should be respected and free trade should be permitted. A third agreement committed the United States, Britain, France, and Japan to consult if tensions should arise in this sphere. So let's be careful, they agreed with one another. If we sense tensions going up, let's talk rather than shoot. That was an agreement also signed at the Washington Naval Conference in early 1922. And that agreement sort of kept the peace, restored the stability for the remainder of the decade. Trouble began to develop in 1929, however, with the onset of the Great Depression. You probably know something about the Great Depression and how devastating it was here in the US. What you might not know, but is important to realize, is that the Great Depression afflicted all advanced capitalist economies. It was a global pall, a decline of worldwide economic activity that created stresses and strains in every theater. And it certainly strained US-Japanese relations. During the 1920s, for instance, trade between the two powers had grown healthy to about $400 million a year. And in addition to that, the US banks floated loans of about another $400 million a year to Japanese industry. But after the onset of the Great Depression, that economic activity dried up. Trade fell from $400 million a year to $100 million a year from 1929 to 1932. The stream of loans to Japanese investment opportunities became practically nothing for $400 million a year. US and Japanese firms began competing again fiercely for markets in China. Tension began to grow. Japanese nationalists, who had never been happy with cultural biases in US law, began to protest discriminatory laws that were common in the United States. Many Western states had laws on their books that flagrantly discriminated against persons of Asian descent. The US Congress passed a series of immigration restriction laws in the mid-1920s that were wantonly biased against persons of Asian ethnicity. And Japanese nationalists took offense at that kind of legal discrimination, and tension resulted from that as well. So the Great Depression stimulated a rise in US-Japanese tension that would definitely put the two powers, in retrospect, on the path to war. Trouble began in 1931 with an incident in Manchuria. Technically, the Manchuria is depicted here in green, technically part of China, but just there beyond Japan's Korean possession. China was continuing to weaken. China was tumbling towards civil war between nationalists and communists. And the Japanese, their feeling of tension with the US and other powers rising, their sense of nationalist pride on the uptake, decided to manufacture an incident at a place called Mukden Bridge and blame it on the Chinese and use that as a pretext to invade and occupy Manchuria, a step that they accomplished in 1931, 1932. Upon occupying Manchuria, they declared that Manchuria was now known as the state of Manchukuo, an allied partner, really part of the empire of Japan. So they, sort of engaged in aggressive territorial conquest at the expense of their once great and still sizable neighbor. How did the US react to the occupation of Manchuria? US policy was formulated by President Herbert Hoover and his Secretary of State Henry Stimson. They, of course, were in the throes of the Great Depression at home. They were struggling to staunch the utter collapse of the American economy and the rising misery of the American people. And the last thing they wanted was to risk a shooting war against the growing Japanese empire. And yet they didn't want to give in either, because that type of appeasement seemingly might encourage further Japanese expansion and certainly would cost the United States economic opportunities in East Asia that might be needed to get out of the Depression in the future. Thus, the US formulated a policy called the Stimson Doctrine, which was a principled declaration that the United States would not recognize the fruits of aggressive attacks, and thus we would not recognize the Japanese control over Manchuria. We would not recognize the puppet state called Manchukuo. Did that work? Well, not really. The Japanese did not alter their occupation of Manchuria. They did not back down from their aggressive action on the continent. And in fact, when the League of Nations, which the US had never joined, but was still the international entity of the era, when the League of Nations voted to urge Japan to withdraw from Manchuria, Japan responded by withdrawing from the League of Nations and defying the international authority of that regime. That set the stage for the arrival of Franklin Roosevelt, elected president in 1932, taking office in March of 1933. Let me back off from the narrative of US-Japanese relations for just a moment to establish the context in which Franklin Roosevelt made policy and the approaches that he brought to office. Priority number one for Franklin Roosevelt very clearly was to deal with the Great Depression. That was the crisis that had cost Herbert Hoover his presidency. That was the crisis that Roosevelt knew he had to solve in order to be a successful president. And Roosevelt took a very inward-looking approach to the Great Depression, as revealed in these lines out of his first inaugural in March of '33, essentially saying that international matters are important, but secondary in importance to solving the Great Depression at home. Thus, as he put it, the emergency at home cannot wait on the accomplishment of restoring any kind of international trade. Roosevelt thus became very inward-focused during the early years of his administration. A second challenge for Roosevelt was dealing with a massive wave of isolationism that swept the American people. 25% unemployment by 1933, red lines like this, a common feature in most urban areas of the United States. The American people were not ready to get involved in foreign struggles. They decided instead to rely on the traditional policy of assuming that the two oceans would provide defense of the homeland and the rest of the world would have to take care of itself. Isolationism became manifest in a series of laws that Congress passed in the mid-1930s. Congress conducted a series of investigations of how and why the U.S. had gotten involved in World War I. And it reached the conclusion that involvement in World War I had been a mistake, that all of the doughboys who had died in vain for European imperial causes, that we were tricked into getting into the war by wily industrialists who wanted to profit from selling weapons, the so-called merchants of death in the popular parlance of the day, or that the British tricked us into thinking the Germans were Huns and led us into this wild crusade in Europe. Out of that kind of thinking came these laws that dramatically restricted what Americans could do overseas in terms of trade or sending ships or engaging in any kind of economic activity that might risk dragging the country into war. A legal manifestation of the profound sense of isolationism that had swept the United States. Roosevelt also had to deal with problems in Europe. Adolf Hitler had taken power in Germany in 1933, several weeks before Roosevelt came to office. And it wasn't long before Hitler began to flex his muscle. It wasn't long before Hitler began to expand in Central Europe, as this map shows, occupying the Rhineland in 1936, annexing Austria in 1938, gobbling up Czechoslovakia in two stages in 1938 and 1939. The rise of Hitler portended war on that continent, and that was certainly the top foreign policy concern in Roosevelt's mind. I've got to concentrate on Europe. Hitler is the main menace out there. The Japanese are a nuisance, but not nearly as dangerous in Roosevelt's calculus as Europe. The seeds of what would eventually be called the Europe First strategy of wartime diplomacy had been planted. And what was happening in Asia? Well, there was sort of a lull in the middle 1930s. Once Manchuria was consolidated in 1932, Japan kind of rested for half a decade. There were no dramatic acts of aggression or provocations of tension, although that did come to an end in 1937 when Japan resumed its offensive against China proper by attacking and eventually occupying Shanghai in July of 1937, a military operation that consolidated for Japan a chunk of imperial territory in the heart of China by early 1938. During that conflict, U.S. sailors were killed. There was a small U.S. Navy gunboat sailing on the Yangtze River in December of 1937. It had gone up the river to protect some U.S. oil company executives. It was strafed by a Japanese fighter. 2 U.S. Navy sailors were killed. That could have perhaps provoked a war scare, but it didn't. Roosevelt wasn't ready to be provoked. He was not eager for a war. Diplomats quickly came to the table and reached a settlement which included an apology by Japan and payment of a reparations payment to the families of the dead. Japan followed the next year with the declaration of something called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was a euphemistic sounding initiative essentially to reinvigorate the 21 demands of World War I, to make clear that Japan was not going to accept the open door policy of the United States, that Japan now saw itself as a leading imperial power who would organize an Asian system of states and economic arrangements to the exclusion of North American and European powers. This was an articulation of the Japanese vision of becoming the giant of the East Asian theater. How did President Roosevelt react to the rise of Japanese power in this 1937-38 wave? Well, he began to bristle a little bit. He began to push back a little bit in a variety of ways, although still modest ways. In October of 1937, he gave a famous address, sometimes called the Quarantine Speech, delivered in Chicago, Illinois, in which he declared that aggressors must be quarantined. Aggressors must be quarantined as if aggression were some kind of disease. That was his way of pushing back by diplomatic declaration. He also prudently ordered the military services to begin to take some modest preparations for war. For instance, fortifying some of the bases in the Pacific. For instance, beginning an initiative to build naval warplanes, just in case. Let's be ready. It wasn't much, but it was some movement in that direction. And yet, Roosevelt didn't do much more, but then the scholarly retrospective inquiry might say, what other options did he have? What more could he have done, maybe, to nip in the bud this emerging Japanese expansion, this portent of Japanese aggression? He didn't have many options. The economy still was not sound at home. The U.S. military was still paltry on the international standards of the day. The American people were still locked in a mindset of isolationism. The neutrality laws were binding on the president. He was under legal restriction not to allow certain things to happen that might risk war. And so he didn't go beyond these very modest initial steps. Japan did not really respect or positively react to the American countermeasures, as modest as they were. Rather, the Japanese made clear that they were going to adhere to their expansionist policy. They were not going to yield or retreat from their ambitious schemes in China proper. This moves us to stage 3 of my discussion, which is to concentrate, as I said, on the crucial period of 1939 to 1941, when the tension between the two powers clearly escalated and the die for war was cast. The period opened really coincidental to the outbreak of war in Europe, because the war in Europe consumed the attention and resources of the European powers. The European colonial possessions in East Asia seemingly became ripe for the taking in the eyes of Japanese expansionists. The fall of France in the spring of 1941, the fall of Holland in 1940, the fall of Holland just a few weeks before, the fact that the British were fighting for their lives in the Battle of Britain in the summer and fall of 1940, these factors created a vacuum of power in the European colonial possessions in East Asia and tempted the Japanese mightily to begin to move toward territorial acquisition. They started in late 1939, occupying Hainan Island just off the coast of China proper. By 1940, they were probing into southern China, moving into southern China, and probing into Indochina, the French colony, under the control of the Vichy regime, which was somewhat compliant with the arrival of Japanese power. In September 1940, the Japanese Empire also signed the Tripartite Pact, a military alliance with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Another sign of Japan's growing international stature and another layer of danger, if you will, in the perception by the United States of Japanese military power. This sudden rise of Japanese expansion in 1939 and 1940 created some pretty acute dilemmas for the United States government, for the Franklin Roosevelt administration. On the one hand, Japanese militarism and expansionism clearly seemed dangerous. It clearly seemed that this wave of Japanese growth could lead to absolutely no good for the United States or for the European powers who the United States were hoping would win World War II. However, against that concern, Roosevelt faced his abiding belief that Europe was more important. Europe had to come first. We've got to concentrate on that theater. If we're going to get into a war, it ought to be in Europe, not in Asia, because Hitler, not the Japanese, are the major menace. And, somewhat by contrast, Roosevelt also knew that U.S.-Japanese trade had reached fairly healthy levels by the late 1930s. It was back into the late 1920s level of trade. In other words, it had overcome the impact of the Great Depression, and Roosevelt, eager to solve the Great Depression at home, had come to see trade like that as healthy for the American economy. Roosevelt also calculated, essentially, what can I do? What is the likely impact of any resistance I can offer? I don't have the wherewithal to fight them. If I push them too hard, I might end up in a war with them, which I don't want. I'm at least going to decimate the trade that our struggling economy certainly needs. This was a devil's dilemma, a devil of a dilemma that troubled Roosevelt and resulted in him sort of being unsure what to do and hence not doing very much at all. Feeling incapable, feeling it was too chancy to try to push back against this surge of Japanese power. Now, Roosevelt did take some steps, again, modest steps. In July of 1939, after Japan occupied Hahn Island, he did renounce a U.S.-Japanese trade agreement. And let me explain the technical importance of that step. He didn't cut off trade, but he renounced an agreement so that he would have the legal permission to cut off trade at some point in the future if he deemed it necessary. He could embargo trade against the Japanese. This is kind of like in diplomatic work, firing a warning shot across the bow of an adversarial ship. It's a maneuver to warn the other side that we're moving towards serious behavior. If you're not careful, there might be more just like that coming. He also ordered the Navy to move its fleet from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor in 1940. In July 1940, after Japan moved into Indochina, he took the step of actually beginning to embargo the trade of some commodities with the Japanese, limited commodities, like aviation gasoline and certain kinds of scrap iron. After the Tripartite Pact was signed in September, he tightened the embargo to include certain kinds of machine tools and chemicals. Some of his advisors said, let's embargo oil. That'll really punch the Japanese in the gut. Roosevelt hesitated to take that step because he knew the Japanese were dependent on American oil, and he feared that if he went to that extreme of a measure, it might provoke a war, which he didn't want, and he wasn't ready to fight. So a gradual, escalating embargo, but stopping short of the granddaddy trade prize of them all, and that was the oil supply that the U.S. was sending to the Empire of Japan. Roosevelt also began to issue economic aid to the nationalist government of China, which was offering largely ineffective but spirited resistance, military resistance to the Japanese occupation of the country. About $100 billion of aid was sent to nationalist China in 1940. FDR's administration also tried negotiations to try to keep a lid on the emerging crisis, the emerging tension between the two powers. He relied on his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, to head up this effort. Cordell Hull announced some principles for settlement. He announced them to the Japanese government. He said, essentially, if you want to maintain the peace, we expect you to honor certain key principles, like the open door policy, which of course the Japanese had repudiated with their greater East Asian prosperity sphere. He also said you have to adhere to the principle of only peaceful change in the Pacific theater. No more use of armies and navies to march in, conquer, and kill. We have to talk, we have to handle this like civilized powers. These principles, of course, were diametrically opposed to the practices that Japan had demonstrated. Japan made very clear that it was not going to concede very much, and thus the negotiations led to a deadlock, although they did perhaps help avoid war. The two powers were talking, and while they were talking, at least perhaps that discouraged the more militant minds in both countries from advocating some kind of military conflict. Tensions increased even further in the summer of 1941 when Japan made the fateful decision to occupy all of Indochina. It had begun probing into Indochina in 1940. In July 1941, it occupied all of Indochina. Indochina had been a French colony, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It had been a French colony because of the collapse of French power in Europe. Japan essentially moved in and picked the ripe fruit of the French colonial entity. When Japan occupied Indochina in July of 41, Roosevelt responded with the equally fateful step of finally pulling the plug on the sale of oil to the Japanese Empire. Keep in mind that some of his advisors had been recommending that step for many months, and FDR had resisted because he feared it might lead to an escalation to war. But in July 41, he was persuaded that he had to ratchet up his response, that he couldn't tolerate any more Japanese expansion,